in my research project on household bargaining power and financial inclusion. So an introduction, my project focuses on informal financial institutions in the form of rotating savings and credit associations, ROSCAs, and village savings and loan associations, VSLAs, which are basically two different names for the same kind of informal financial group. So these are informal groups that are created by individuals who each contribute an amount of money, which is then dispersed to a different group member at different times. Financial inclusion is often cited as an important driver of women's empowerment, but what if women are excluded from participation in financial institutions in the first place because of their inadequate bargaining power in the household? So I reject the unitary household model and I adopt a bargaining household model in which members are motivated by different preferences for goods. So an overview of the literature, a lot of the literature has focused on the relationship between financial inclusion as a driver for women's empowerment. So Pitt-Konderker and Cartwright find microcredit participation positively affecting women's empowerment in Bangladesh. There's also been another study by Hashimi et al. That finds participation in credit programs has a positive impact on women. And then Anderson and Balan, which is the article I presented on a couple of weeks ago, did the first kind of study in terms of how does women's bargaining power actually influence financial inclusion and participation in financial institutions. And their study focused mainly on using income as a proxy for bargaining power. So there have also been some other studies that have explored how women's bargaining power affects other outcomes, mainly in terms of like fertility and health, consumption, investment, and development through public goods. And here I have a table of all of the measures and indicators of women's bargaining power that are most often used in the literature. As you can see, income and employment is probably the most popular and most often cited, but there are other measures including asset ownership, human capital, decision-making, and attitudes in particular. So my data comes from the Women's Empowerment and Agricultural Index in Uganda. It's pilot data from 2012, and it's a survey that was launched in collaboration by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, USAID, and IFPRI. It's a survey that has actually been implemented in many developing countries to measure women's control over critical parts of their lives in the household, community, and economy. And the data covers 5 regions in Uganda, and my sample in particular, which I've shortened down a bit, only composes 275 households, which are merely just the couples, so the man and the wife married or cohabitating, and this results in 550 total individuals. So my methodology, this is the model that I will be estimating. My dependent variable is VSLA participation. It's a dummy variable. And then my main independent variables of focus are these measures of bargaining power. So right now I'm focusing mostly on asset ownership and then different indexes for household decision making. The data has a lot of different variables and questions that have been asked in regards to these two measures. And then also I intend to look at the disaggregation of bargaining power and which member, how much share they have in the total couple's bargaining power, so at different levels and categories of 25%. I also include some control variables, individual characteristics, household characteristics, and community characteristics. Since the model has some issues with endogeneity because bargaining power and empowerment is often cited as a result of financial inclusion and not a cause of it, I need to correct for this endogeneity using instrumental variables, and 2 that have been identified in the literature and which I have data for in my sample are the age difference in the couple and then education. These are particularly important indicators of asset ownership and decision-making power. And so I use an Ivy Probit, 2SLS Probit model. And some of the challenges that I've had so far are due to the data that I have and the construction of the various bargaining power indexes and weights of the contributing variables. Because empowerment is not a very measurable or concrete term, the weights that I'm giving and the creation of these indexes is a little bit subjective. So I'm still kind of playing around with the different weights and measures and best creation of these indexes. And then also identification of efficient instrumental variables, which I have not been able to find much of in my data set as well. So that's been a challenge. This is summary descriptive statistics of the data. So you can see the total sample, which includes both the husband and the wife, and then the women only. And then I also have some descriptive statistics on education level and employment status. And then this is the first category of 13 variables that form my first decision-making index. So as you can see, these are all categorical variables. And for each variable, the question is asked who makes the decision for each of these. And it's categorized as either no decision and jointly with their spouse or their self. So as you can see, women for a lot of the categories tend to not have as much power or share with decisions that are made solely by themselves, but tend to have more share with joint decisions or no decision in the variable. The same is with asset ownership. So again, these are different categories for assets. Asset ownership, it's categorized again as either no ownership jointly with their spouse or self. And you can see that women tend to have less self-ownership and more joint ownership or no ownership of a lot of the assets. And I've also broken these down into secure assets, which have a lower return, and then riskier assets, which have a higher return. And the disaggregation is below, you can see, which are categorized in each. So these are some kernel density estimates that describe the data. The first two at the top are share of assets. It's an index that I created that heavily weights the risky assets. So you can see that men tend to have a larger share of the assets in the couple and women tend to have less. Same for risky assets, men tend to have more of the share of the couple's riskier assets and women tend to have less. Secure assets, men also generally tend to have more, but women also they have a little bit more share of secure assets than they did with riskier assets, up until about 80%. And then I also created this share of decision-making index based on those 13 variables from earlier, where I weighted them all the same equally. And you can see that the distribution of the share between men and women is pretty similar. So these are very preliminary results based on my data. As I mentioned, I'm still trying to determine the best system for weighting the assets and each of the variables and the indexes that I'm creating. So you can see the first variable that I'm looking at is the share of assets. I used equal weight for that, and then I also heavily weighted the riskier assets in that index as well. And so both of those were positive, though not statistically significant, indicators of VSLA participation. And then I also broke down secure assets and risky assets. It's interesting that riskier assets, a greater share of riskier assets will has a larger impact on VSLA participation than secure assets, though it's neither as significant. And then the share of decision-making index had the largest coefficient, though again, it was still not statistically significant, though all of these variables did have a positive relationship with the VSLA participation. So in conclusion, I don't have very many significant results to report yet, as I'm still researching and deciding some of the best ways to construct these indexes and weight these variables. As challenge, again, is the lack of valid instruments that I've been finding. And then I also still intend to include the other control variables, which is obviously important. And then to disaggregate each of the share of bargaining power variables to see if there's different impacts at each of those 25% categories. So that's where I'm at. Thanks so much.